Tensions seem to be building up between the US and Venezuela, which seem to be going a bit unnoticed because everyone appears to be obsessed with some White House renovations. And those who are paying attention are fearful that the US is going to invade Venezuela. I don't personally think it's going to happen, but I think we do have better examples to look at than Iraq, which is what my fellow millennials are habituated to do. And with Nicolas Maduro openly requesting aid from Russia, I'm reminded of another Moscow-aligned Latin American dictatorship the US invaded.
Ladies and gentlemen, on Sunday, October 23rd, the United States received an urgent formal request from the 5 member nations of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to assist in a joint effort to restore order and democracy on the island of Grenada.
In October of 1983, the United States launched Operation Urgent Fury, a mission to depose a Marxist regime whose infighting had let the island fall into anarchy and place 1,000 American citizens in danger who were attending the medical school in St. George's. The invasion of Grenada falls into this late Cold War time period where President Reagan and the neoconservatives, as they would later be dubbed, gradually tried to wean the American public off its fear of military intervention after Vietnam, eventually leading to the Gulf War, which I have a video about right here that you can watch. And although it's important to understand the event in the context of what we know now, it's just as important to understand it in the context of what they knew at the time. My name is Grant and you're watching Casual Historian, and this is the video about the international story of Operation Urgent Fury. Let's get started.
Stan, why don't you tell one of your exciting Grenada stories that everyone loves? Including Steve?
Oh, nobody wants to hear any of my stupid stories.
You're in Grenada? Barry, don't encourage...
Why don't you pull up a couple of chairs? October 30th, we were pinned down by the enemy, and I just learned Johnson was going to the USO Halloween pageant as Ms. Pac-Man, which meant I had less than 24 hours to come up with a whole new costume.
Grenada remained largely untouched by European colonialism until the mid-17th century, when it was conquered by the French, who gave the island its current name. And like most Caribbean colonies, it was used to grow cash crops, like sugar, cocoa, and indigo, which were harvested by African slaves. The British would capture the island during the 7 Years' War and would oversee the eventual abolition of slavery in 1833 and the introduction of its largest export, nutmeg, in the 1840s. Like most Caribbean colonies, they steadily grew poorer throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries due to alternative sources of sugar being developed. After an attempt to federate their colonies in the West Indies failed, Grenada would be granted full autonomy over its domestic affairs in 1967, and then be given full independence within the Commonwealth of Nations in 1974, under the premiership of its populist Prime Minister, Sir Eric Gairy, despite some in London seeing Grenada as not being fully prepared for independence. Eric Gairy's United Labour Party would quickly be challenged from the left by the New Jewel movement, a Marxist-Leninist party led by Maurice Bishop, a young lawyer educated in England. The party formed a coalition with the Grenada National Party in 1976, but they lost to Gairy and United Labour. Around this time, the Cubans began aiding the New Jewel movement with money and arms, in hopes of using the island as a base to further expand their influence and eventually take functional control of Grenada. In fairness to the New Jewel movement, Gairy's government was very corrupt, and many suspected the 1976 election results to have been fraudulent, which is why there wasn't much domestic backlash when Maurice Bishop overthrew Gairy's government in March of 1979. This coup was bloodless due to its timing. Gairy was out of the country, so all Bishop and his men had to do was show up to Parliament with guns in hand. And as a fun footnote, Gairy was visiting the United Nations to talk about UFOs. When he took over, he initially promised to hold early elections, but instead he suspended the Constitution, dismissed Parliament, and established the People's Revolutionary Government, which would rule by decree until its collapse in 1983. The Cubans denied any involvement in the coup, and at first tried to avoid attention from the US and UK, but by April they were covertly delivering arms to Grenada, and after they established formal diplomatic relations, Cuba began sending military advisors and establishing a military mission. They also sent their own secret police to help Bishop set up his own internal security apparatus. Under Bishop's government, Grenada joined Cuba as one of only 2 countries that didn't condemn the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan later that year. The biggest concern for the US prior to 1983 was the airport the Cubans began building in Point Salinas in November 1979. Castro would send hundreds of Cuban workers to construct a military-grade runway, which the US suspected would be used or made available to the Cuban or Soviet militaries for operations in the Western Hemisphere. This project would be too expensive for either the Grenadians or the Cubans to fund themselves, so Maurice Bishop would reach out to other anti-Western regimes for money, receiving contributions from Saddam Hussein of Iraq, Hafez al-Assad of Syria, Chadi Ben-Jadid of Algeria, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Although the Soviets were happy to have another ally in the Western Hemisphere, their interests in Grenada were less materialistic. The Soviet Union valued the new dual regime in Grenada as a symbol of declining US power and expanding Marxist influence in Latin America. Moscow initially kept the Grenadians publicly at arm's length, effectively masking the growing military relationship. The captured documents show that direct Soviet influence was brought to bear on party organization, ideological training, and management of the failing Grenadian economy. The Soviets were involved in providing weapons to Bishop's regime, usually transferring them via Cuba. But Bishop had hoped for more economic aid from the USSR to help float their floundering regime. Grenada would sign tons of secret treaties with communist governments around the world to receive arms and training for his party cadres. The overall picture presented by the evidence is that by October 1983, the USSR and Cuba had made real progress toward turning Grenada into a center for further subversion of the region. Grenada's military was built up to be the largest in the Eastern Caribbean, which posed a real threat to its neighbors. Grenada was one of the sponsors of Operation Red Dog, a plot by white supremacists in the US and Canada to overthrow the government of Dominica in 1981. Which is a crazy story in and of itself, but that's a rabbit hole for another video. But all of this obscured the internal party struggles going on within the New Jewel movement. But one thing you won't want obscured are the gorgeous watches from this video's sponsor. Presidis is a watch brand inspired by the legacy of the US military, reviving old-style timepieces from the 1940s that were worn by soldiers at some of the most famous battles in history, with many of them themed to these events from World War II, such as this piece I'm wearing here, which is commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima, a symbol of victory, sacrifice, and grit. Presidis watches are built in America, with many of the designs made in collaboration with veterans and with durability in mind. This watch has a 38mm stainless steel case with diamond-like carbon back coating and a double-domed acrylic crystal, which provides a wide viewing angle with minimal distortion. It's got a double-layer dial that is infused with actual sand from Iwo Jima, letting you bring a piece of that battlefield with you wherever you go. And this watch is available now, linked down in the description. And you can use my discount code CasualHistorian10 to get 10% off your order. So if you want yourself a stylish watch inspired by a legacy of resilience, check it out now. Thanks to Presidis for sponsoring this video, but for now, let's get back to the history. But all of this obscured the internal party struggles going on within the New Jewel movement. Like most communists, Maurice Bishop made promises that he had no way of keeping. He promised to grow the economy and provide more government services, but the collective farms were a disaster, and his nationalization of numerous industries scared off foreign investors. And things got worse with the commodities crash of the early 1980s, leading to Grenada's biggest export, nutmeg, not generating the revenue it used to. Frequent power outages and a worsening economy laid the groundwork for internal challenges to Bishop's authority. Bishop had also grown unpopular within the party leadership by centralizing more and more authority within the office of Prime Minister. They also grew tired of him constantly seeking Cuban approval for policies in Grenada, seeing him as a puppet of Castro. Bishop's deputy prime minister, Bernard Coard, would criticize him at a Central Committee meeting in October of 1982, accusing him of weak leadership by slow-walking the transition to full socialism, while also undermining his own authority as chairman of the party. Coard would resign from the Central Committee and Politburo in protest, but in response, Bishop and the Central Committee initiated a purge of the party in order to remove alleged non-Leninists. This purge would do more than anger rival factions of the party. Under the People's Revolutionary Government, only party members could work government jobs. Purging members from the party meant that there were fewer people to do these government jobs, which meant that an already ineffective system became even more dysfunctional. Distrust grew more in June of 1983, when Bishop visited the US, where he had a meeting with President Reagan's National Security Advisor, William Clark. This made members of the party and his regime suspect he was planning to sell them out to the Americans. In July, Coard would visit Moscow, where it is believed the Soviets either ordered him or gave him the green light to remove Bishop from power. Bishop knew that the party was growing distrustful of him, and so in September and October he made trips to the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Cuba in hopes of reassuring them of his communist bona fides. But this wouldn't be enough. Shortly after his return to Grenada, a cabinet meeting saw Bishop accuse Coard of plotting his assassination, to which Coard resigned the deputy prime ministership in protest. In the months prior to this meeting, Coward had worked behind the scenes to gradually reduce Bishop's power within the party, which was supported by party officers. The next day, October 13, 1983, Bernard Coward, along with General Hudson Austin, would launch a coup against Bishop, placing him and his inner circle under house arrest, and replacing the People's Revolutionary Government with the Revolutionary Military Council. This was followed by the radio station being shut down and all flights in and out of Grenada being cancelled. Tensions escalated until October 19th, when an angry crowd freed Bishop and his inner circle from their house arrests and marched to the harbor in St. George's, where soldiers would open fire on the crowd, killing Bishop. This was followed by Cuban soldiers taking Bernard Coward into protective custody under the orders of General Austin. The Grenada crisis was in full swing. How exactly would the Americans respond to this? The Carter administration had been hesitant to recognize Bishop's government after their 1979 coup, but decided to do so after consulting with the UK and other Eastern Caribbean states. But when Bishop suspended the Constitution and began opening relations with Cuba, the administration sent him a warning to refrain, but Bishop would respond defiantly. No country has the right to tell us what to do or how to run our country or who to be friendly with. We are not in anybody's backyard, and we are definitely not for sale. The Americans would begin to distance themselves from Grenada, especially after construction began at the Salinas airport. Pictures from U.S. reconnaissance planes saw that the runway was capable of receiving heavy cargo. The airport was far larger than anything that might be required by even the most expanded tourist trade, and it was clear from the size, as well as the nature of the runway and the supporting facilities, that a great deal more than commercial use was intended. Construction of the airport would continue to be a concern for the U.S., with President Reagan publicly expressing his concerns in March of 1983, which were historically overshadowed due to him introducing his Strategic Defense Initiative in the same speech.
On the small island of Grenada, at the southern end of the Caribbean chain, the Cubans, with Soviet financing and backing, are in the process of building an airfield with a 10,000-foot runway. Grenada doesn't even have an air force. Who is it intended for? The Caribbean is a very important passageway for our international commerce and military lines of communication. More than half of all American oil imports now pass through the Caribbean. The rapid buildup of Grenada's military potential is unrelated to any conceivable threat to this island country of under 110,000 people, and totally at odds with the pattern of other Eastern Caribbean states, most of which are unarmed. The Soviet-Cuban militarization of Grenada, in short, can only be seen as power projection into the region, and it is in this important economic and strategic area that we're trying to help the governments of El Salvador, Costa Rica, Honduras, and others in their struggles for democracy against guerrillas supported through Cuba and Nicaragua.
The Reagan administration would go further in trying to isolate Maurice Bishop's regime, first by not sending an ambassador to Grenada, as well as denying the credentials of Grenada's ambassador. They would also increase aid to all of Grenada's neighbors, as well as discouraging international institutions from providing loans to Bishop's government. But the administration would attempt to thaw relations in the summer of 1983, when they invited Maurice Bishop to visit D.C. William Clark told Bishop the only way to improve relations with the U.S. was to distance himself from Cuba and the Soviets, moderate his policies, and stop the hostile rhetoric toward the U.S. After the meeting, the administration would keep an eye on Grenada for the next 3 months, and if no steps had been taken toward the conditions given to Bishop, they would begin looking for ways to neutralize the threat. By the end of the summer, not only had Bishop not made any steps toward liberalizing, but had gone out of his way to reassure his allies that they would remain in the communist camp. The administration would seek to further isolate Grenada, encouraging its neighbors to consider military action. They also began to discuss the potential security threats of Grenada with congressional leaders, an attempt to get the medical school at St. George's to relocate to a neighboring country, which would not only get the American students attending there out of harm's way, but also deprive Bishop's regime of a source of revenue. U.S. intelligence starts paying close attention to the happenings in Grenada after Bishop returns from his trip to Eastern Europe, with the State Department beginning to draw up evacuation plans. Now, the British were always less concerned about the goings-on in Grenada. Thatcher and her foreign minister, Geoffrey Howe, saw Bishop as an indignant but ultimately pragmatic leader, and saw Reagan as exaggerating the Soviets' interest in the country and even its airport expansion. So the position on the eve of the overthrow of Maurice Bishop was that Grenada had an unsavory and undemocratic regime with close and friendly ties with Cuba, On such an analysis, the coup of 10th October 1983, morally objectionable as it was a change in degree rather than in kind. But as tensions heightened after Bishop's arrest, American concerns only grew. The Prime Minister of Dominica, Eugenia Charles, who had survived a Grenadian-backed attempt to overthrow her own government just 2 years earlier, would orally request U.S. intervention on October 17th. Secretary of State George Shultz would ask her to formally request intervention via the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, creating a special task force on Grenada the next day in anticipation. This served two purposes. First, it attended to her request and showed her that we were responsive and alert. And second, it set the stage for the United States to act in a manner consistent with our national interest and with international law. On the 19th, before news of Bishop's death had reached foreign players, both Jamaica and Barbados would ask the US and the UK to intervene. Thatcher would oppose intervention and would cite the lack of a formal request for intervention as a sign that no intervention was going to happen. But news of Bishop's death would spark rioting and looting across Grenada, which General Austin Hudson would respond to by imposing a nationwide curfew with orders to shoot violators on sight. The Reagan administration tried evacuating American citizens peacefully by chartering private jets and a cruise ship to pick up the students at St. George's, but General Austin wouldn't grant planes permission to land or ships permission to dock. The president feared they might have a repeat of the Iran hostage crisis on their hands, but with more captives and the Soviets involved. Members of the cabinet were concerned over what measures Reagan would be willing to employ in order to avoid Carter's fate. I'll get back to the story in a second, because right now I want to tell you that the Casual Historian 2025 audience survey is now live. Every year, I create a survey using Google Forms in order to get information about my audience, such as demographics, their social media habits, as well as what topics and kinds of videos they'd be interested in seeing. I use this data to make business decisions and help create videos that I hope you guys will enjoy and improve your experience here. So if you're a regular viewer of my videos and you would like to have a say in what kinds of videos I make in the future, I would appreciate it if you went down to the description and clicked on the survey link and filled that out for me. But with that out of the way, let's get back to the history. On October 20th, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff to begin preliminary planning to see what military options were available on short notice. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North mentions that a fully equipped Marine force attached to the USS Independence was headed for deployments in Lebanon and could be redirected south. None of them were willing to divert manpower and resources away from the mission in Beirut without the president's approval, and so they deferred until they got word from Reagan. At this time, the CIA estimated that there were about 500 Cubans on the island, and although the American med students hadn't faced any direct hostility from either the regime or the populace yet, Venezuela, as well as neighboring Caribbean countries, had already withdrawn the families as well as unessential staff from their respective embassies. And due to a lack of their own embassy in Grenada, as well as the inexperience of the American ambassador in Barbados, the U.S. didn't have much on-the-ground intelligence from Grenada. Caribbean leaders began publicly speaking out against the violent and repressive methods of the regime in Grenada, cutting off diplomatic relations. In the early hours of October 21st, President Reagan gave the go-ahead to redirect the USS Independence towards the south. And later that night, the OECS, along with representatives from Jamaica and Barbados, met and voted to formally request the United States to intervene in Grenada. President Reagan receives a call from his new National Security Advisor, Bud McFarlane, at 4 a.m. to inform him of the OECS's formal request for military intervention. When the president is told that a rescue mission could be prepared in 48 hours, he gives the go-ahead. But they need to move quickly and maintain absolute secrecy, for fear of alerting the Grenadians or the Cubans, turning the fear of a hostage crisis into a reality. There was another reason I wanted secrecy. It was what I call the post-Vietnam syndrome, the resistance of many in Congress to the use of military force abroad for any reason, because of our nation's experience in Vietnam. No rational person ever wants to unleash military force, but I believe there are situations when it is necessary for the United States to do so, especially when the defense of freedom and democracy is involved or the lives and liberty of our citizens are at stake. Weinberger had urged against military intervention, but was overruled by the president. George Shultz still feared that the Secretary of Defense would slow-walk preparation for the operation long enough for information to leak, which would take most military options off the table. Most of October 22nd was spent planning the invasion of Grenada, but Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher would receive a report that the United States National Security Council had decided to take a cautious approach to the situation, with the Americans trying to reassure the UK that the movement of ships into the Caribbean was simply about giving them options. British and Commonwealth officials in the Caribbean weren't giving distress signals or requests for aid from Thatcher's government, and so she presumed calm was winning the day. Despite this, Foreign Minister Howe would order the HMS Antrim to head from Colombia toward Grenada in case British citizens needed to be evacuated. Later that day, Barbados informed London that the OECS had met and approved military intervention, but hadn't formally requested aid from the UK itself. A conversation between Howe and a US State Department official made him believe that the US still wasn't planning to intervene. At 2:30 a.m. on October 23, 1983, President Reagan receives another call, telling him about the suicide bombers that attacked the US Marine barracks in Beirut. You can learn more about the horrors of the attack itself as well as the US response to it in this previous video, but in this story, the attack had a single silver lining. That being, it gave the administration a publicly and politically acceptable excuse to cancel a bunch of events that would let them have time to finish planning their operation in Grenada. The final plan of action had points for creating legal and political cover for intervention, which were met by both the OECS's request to intervene, as well as a State Department legal opinion that cited rights and obligations under the UN, Organization of American States, and the War Powers Act. They prepared statements and messages for U.S. embassies and planned for an immediate return to civilian rule in Grenada, with a restoration of the Constitution Bishop had suspended in 1979. And most importantly for the Pentagon, a plan for an early withdrawal of U.S. forces. Back in the UK, the Conservative Party was opposed to intervention in Grenada, while the Liberals were actually supportive, seeing the situation there as a consequence of the British Empire not properly preparing them for self-governance. On October 24th, Geoffrey Howe speaks to the House of Commons and reassures them that military intervention in Grenada is highly unlikely. On October 24th, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, Reagan sent a secured message to Thatcher, informing her that he is considering intervention in Grenada. Both Howe and Thatcher were opposed to this, especially as they had been led to believe that that option had been taken off the table. Both Howe and Thatcher had prior engagements they needed to attend, and so they couldn't send a message immediately, but had assistants draft messages for them to deliver when they returned to Downing Street. At 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Reagan sends Thatcher a second message, saying he had made the decision to go ahead with the operation. At 8 p.m., President Reagan meets with the congressional leadership in the Yellow Oval Room to tell them about the impending invasion of Grenada. Republicans were supportive, but the Democratic leaders felt this meeting was insufficient. Mr. President, I have been informed, but not consulted. Thatcher and Howe returned to Downing Street shortly after midnight Greenwich Mean Time and discovered the message Reagan had sent them 30 minutes earlier, to which Thatcher sends off a message warning the president about the dangers and potential political consequences the invasion might mean in Britain. This action will be seen as intervention by a Western country in the internal affairs of a small independent nation, however unattractive its regime. I ask you to consider this in the context of our wider East-West relations, and of the fact that we will be having in the next few days to present to our parliament and people the sitting of cruise missiles in this country. I cannot conceal that I am deeply disturbed by your latest communication. You asked for my advice. I have set it out and hope even at this late stage you will take it into account before events are irrevocable. She would then make a direct call to the White House at 8:50 p.m. EST, interrupting Reagan's meeting with congressional leaders in the Yellow Oval. You have asked for my advice, and I want you to consider the points I have made very carefully indeed. Margaret, I must tell you that we are already at 0. Reagan would write about the interaction in his presidential diary. She's upset and doesn't think we should do it. I couldn't tell her it had started. This was one secret we really managed to keep. The invasion was a joint operation between Army paratroopers, the Marines, and Navy SEALs, who would face off against approximately 2,000 Grenadian soldiers and militiamen and hundreds of Cubans. The plan involved first capturing the Point Salinas and Pearls airports, followed by other key installations, and securing the safety of American citizens. The Cuban forces in Grenada were led in battle by Colonel Pedro Tortolo. Most of the Cuban construction workers had some military training, but had been recruited from the territorial militia and would quickly surrender when they made contact with American forces, while Tortolo and other Cuban officers would seek refuge in the Soviet embassy. By 6 a.m. October 25th, the Marines had secured the Pearls airport, while the Army Rangers secured Point Salinas. And although most of the Cuban workers had quickly surrendered, other Cuban forces were putting up a stronger resistance than anticipated. By 9 a.m. October 26th, Castro was looking for a ceasefire, with Secretary Shultz communicating to him through back channels that all Cubans who surrendered would be returned home unharmed, and that the Cuban commander in Grenada should reveal himself and give the order to stand down. By 6 p.m., Fort Frederick is captured, securing the last of the American medical students. By this point, at least 600 Cubans had been captured. The Americans began rounding up captured weapons from the Cubans and Grenadians, and began discovering the massive arms caches the Cubans and Soviets had placed across the island. In the Cuban embassy, they would find guns hidden inside the walls, and over 1 million rounds of ammunition hidden under the floorboards. They also find thousands of pages worth of documents, revealing secret communiques and treaties Grenada had made with the communist world, including evidence of both Soviet and Cuban intent to eventually use the expanded airstrip for subversive actions in the Western Hemisphere. But before we continue, I would like to take a moment to thank the channel members and patrons for helping keeping Casual Historian going. These supporters help keep the channel going when the algorithm or the sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. And quite frankly, I would prefer to be a little more dependent on direct support of viewers than on AdSense. Supporters get a number of perks, such as access to an exclusive Discord server, as well as getting your name and the scrolling chyron at the end of videos, as well as early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos. And depending on which level or tier you join at, you also get access to the scripts I use to make the videos, as well as the notes that I use to make those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know that most people who choose to support me or any other creator is because they think what we do has value. They like the videos we make and they want to see us make more and better. And with your support, we can. And so if you believe that you do get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then I would suggest becoming a channel supporter. You could click the join button below this video, or you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian and choose a membership tier that's right for you. The current difference between channel memberships and Patreon is that at the moment, Patreon has more options in case you want to give additional support. And Patreon also offers annual subscriptions, whereas channel memberships at the moment only offer month to month. So thanks to all the patrons and channel members, past, present, and future, for supporting this channel and making these videos possible. But for now, let's get back to the history. On November 2nd, 1983, hostilities were officially declared over in Grenada.
Before this morning's announcement, I'd like to share some information with you that I received on the phone last night. Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger called to inform me that hostilities in Grenada have ended and that he has instructed our military commanders to begin withdrawing their forces within a few days. What this means is that the situation is stable, no sniper fire or other form of military resistance is evident on the island. Our objectives have been achieved, and as soon as the logistics permit, American personnel will be leaving.
Reagan would call Thatcher to apologize for the embarrassment the invasion had caused her, and explains that his fear of leaks drove his admittedly late consultation with her. The invasion had genuinely caught the British off guard. Both Thatcher and Howe had to face question time in the House of Commons the morning after, having just said the day before that intervention wouldn't happen. The two felt caught in a trap, not being able to fully condone or condemn the operation. The truth is that the government had been humiliated by having its views so plainly disregarded in Washington. For his own part, Secretary Shultz felt like the British were unreasonably angry after the help they had lent dealing with Argentina. I was annoyed. We had turned ourselves into pretzels for Mrs. Thatcher over the Falklands crisis. In his memoir, Geoffrey Howe has a different view. There we have the uncomfortable truth. The special relationship, which George Shultz think we had insufficiently respected, had been in practice set to one side by the U.S. administration itself. Howe blames the internal policy rivalry between Weinberger and Shultz for the alleged misleading. British amour-propre was only an incidental victim of his determination to outwit the Pentagon. He had taught me an important lesson in transatlantic realpolitik, and he had the decency to apologize for doing so. The United Nations General Assembly would adopt Resolution 38-7, stating that it deeply deplores the armed intervention in Grenada. Communist countries would condemn the invasion, with the Soviets claiming the U.S. had been threatening Grenada, and that it was a violation of international law. It is notable that this is the first time the communists lost control of a country since the start of the Cold War. Soviet-backed propaganda outlets in the United States, such as the Covert Action Information Bulletin, would accuse the CIA of fomenting the conflict between Maurice Bishop and Bernard Coard in order to provide the US with a pretext to invade. In Grenada, such backing may have been the expectation of at least some of the members of the Revolutionary Military Council, which plotted the coup against Maurice Bishop. Those collaborators, however, were used and double-crossed by the Reagan administration. Of the two, Cuba was surprisingly the one that had the more reasonable explanation for the events leading up to Urgent Fury. Unfortunately, the division among the Grenadian revolutionaries led to this bloody drama. No doctrine, no principle or claimed revolutionary position, and no internal divisions can justify atrocious acts. And of course, they made sure to reiterate their global popular frontism. Now imperialism will try to use this tragedy and the serious mistakes made by the Grenadian revolutionaries to sweep away the revolutionary process in Grenada and place the country under imperial and neo-colonialist rule once again. Domestically, there were mixed reactions. Democrats and their friendly voices in the media were more focused on questions of the legality of the operations, while President Reagan was quite annoyed with all the evidence of Soviet involvement in Latin America being ignored. And although his actions upset the American political class, the intervention ended up being popular with the public. And President Reagan wasted no time in using the success of the operation to argue against big government, noting that the government is good at some things, such as war, and bad at others, like economic planning. The medical students were returned to the US by October 27th, and after the plane touched down at Charleston Air Force Base, the first student off kissed the ground once on the tarmac. Another student showed their gratitude in a letter to President Reagan. I extend to you my most sincere thanks for the action taken on our behalf in rescuing us from the potential hostage situation that existed in Grenada. The very fact that I am here today with my family proves that you accomplished your primary objective of saving the lives of Americans living there. I can reassure you that what my eyes saw actualized your insight into the grave effects that the completion of the airstrip would have had upon the free world. I can't tell you how much it meant to me to learn of your willingness to endorse the action we have taken. There seems to be a concerted effort on the part of much of the media to downgrade the need for our rescue mission, which they insist on calling an invasion. But not all reactions within the administration were positive. Colin Powell, then serving as the senior military assistant to Deputy Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci, would later write, "It took most of a week to subdue all resistance and rescue the medical students. The invasion was hardly a model of service cooperation. Relations between the services were marred by poor communications, fractured command and control, inter-service parochialism, and micromanagement from Washington. The operation demonstrated how far cooperation among the services still had to go. The invasion of Grenada succeeded, but it was a sloppy success." Military preparedness is something Reagan was very concerned about, and took the responsibility for the lives of his servicemen very seriously. Nothing in my job is more difficult than ordering these fine young Americans into a situation where their lives are at risk. I am hopeful that their very quality and spirit will warn possible adversaries not to attempt violence. They are, in truth, the peacekeepers of the world. Reagan would visit Grenada 3 years later, and was greeted with thunderous applause, introduced as their liberator, Messiah, and Savior.
I'm going to reduce this portion of my discussion to the formal introduction, because after the President has spoken, and we have given him the gift on behalf of yourselves and the government, I propose to have a short, comprehensive wrap-up of this thing to make sure that we all appreciate the unique situation in which we are by not only having the President of the United States of America, our own national hero, but the active participants in the October 25 rescue, 1983. So with that sort of premise, you don't expect me to make a speech. We expect, who you expect to hear now? And that is exactly what you're going to have, because I now present to you our own national hero, our own rescuer after God, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States of America.
Thanks again to Prasidis for sponsoring this video. Click the link in the description and use my discount code CasualHistorian10 to get 10% off your order. If you have any questions about this video or suggestions for future video topics, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. And if you're interested in digging more into the topic of this video or anything else I discussed, all of my sources, as well as the footnotes, are down in the description. I'd also like to thank my newest patrons and channel members for supporting Casual Historian, Zalmy T and Christian Hagberg. Their support allows me to keep making videos when the algorithm or sponsors don't feel too comfortable with the topics. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.